I'm Deborah Steenstra, and I'm a professor of disability studies at the University of Manitoba. And I'm also passionately interested in how policies can be made more inclusive and accessible, especially for people with disabilities. In this video, we're going to talk about some of those policies and how to make things more accessible and inclusive around palliative care. Specifically, what we want to talk, though, is not about palliative care, but about the words we use and about reclaiming some of the language we use, recognizing some of the underlying assumptions that are built into our daily language and into our policies, how we think about policy, and how we implement and practice policy. So in this video, we make an argument to you, to our viewers. We suggest using the thoughts and words of people with disabilities themselves who have reflected on language. That language is important. That we can use words either to lift people's dignity and respect, ensure that they receive dignity and respect, or in some cases language can be used to undermine people's situation and to make them more marginal in mainstream society.
I think most people do not think of where words come from. They don't dig deep into them.
Well, language is a very powerful tool. So we need to be careful how we use words.
When you look at the terminology, I think it's just a negative, another added barrier to the disabled population.
In this video, we're going to talk about the use of three words: vulnerability, suffering, and compassion. And people with disabilities themselves are going to tell us how these words shape their lives, how the use of language creates situations where their experiences can be exclusive or inclusive. The first word we're going to talk about is vulnerability. Often we talk about vulnerable populations, people who are vulnerable, and we think particularly of certain groups. We think of old people, people with disabilities, people in institutional settings as vulnerable. That label, however, suggests that there are some who are vulnerable and some who aren't. Yet as you and I know, each of us can be vulnerable. When we separate out some people and put the label vulnerable people on them, we create expectations that they need protection, that they're separate, that their situation is unique.
People will automatically assume, because you can't walk or because you can't talk or because you can't see, that you are more vulnerable, that you need to be taken care of.
I would hesitate to use the word vulnerable in relation to people with disabilities unless I added in front of the word vulnerable, made vulnerable. People are made vulnerable.
There is a kind of logic underlying the notion of vulnerability. As we follow that logic, if disabled people are vulnerable, and if we don't want bad things to happen to disabled people, we'll have to protect them. The impulse to protect the vulnerable often expresses itself in very oppressive ways. People with disabilities being kept in institutional confinement, people with disabilities being prevented from making decisions and choices.
I don't consider myself vulnerable, even though I am a person with a disability.
I just don't like the idea that people look at me as a woman with a disability who uses an electric wheelchair, that I'm more vulnerable. Everybody's vulnerable.
I'd rather people treated me not as vulnerable, but with dignity and respect.
As the people with disabilities suggest, vulnerability is something that is constructed within society. People are made vulnerable. When we make people vulnerable, we create an unlevel playing field. Our second word is suffering. Often people with disabilities are described as suffering with polio, suffering with multiple sclerosis, and we make a link in our language between the experience of an impairment or condition and the fact that people suffer with this. And as policymakers and people who work in healthcare, we don't want people to suffer. We want to prevent suffering. When we link suffering with experiences of disability, we make it into a tragedy that has to be fixed. Rather, as people with disabilities in these interviews are describing, suffering is actually a normal part of our lives, and disability is also a normal part of my life. The people with disabilities remind us that when we create and implement policies that equate suffering with disabilities, we make the experience of living with disabilities something that is tragic, that has to be fixed, something that is not a normal part of life, rather than accepting it as part of the experience of living.
I cringe every time I hear members of the public use the word suffering when they're describing people with disabilities. Suffering is a dehumanizing term.
When it pops up as just a simple connecting verb, really, to say that so-and-so suffers from cerebral palsy, or suffers from epilepsy, or suffers from paraplegia, the word seems so innocent, really.
I think the worst word for people to be described as is suffering. They suffer from epilepsy. I'm thinking, no, I don't suffer from polio. I have polio, just like I have dark hair. Now I have gray hair. But realistically, it's not that you suffer from it.
There are widespread perceptions in our broader society, within our culture, that we, as disabled people, suffer from our impairments, from the physical or psychiatric conditions that give rise to our disability. So that we suffer losses, that we suffer pain, that we suffer a kind of anguish simply because we have these disabilities, because our bodies, for example, don't conform.
There's an assumption made that people with disabilities are suffering or in pain because of the fact that they have a disability.
There is an intrinsic assessment of suffering and an extrinsic. Do we decide for ourselves whether we are suffering, or is someone else going to be making that decision for us?
When the word suffering is used in relation to persons with disabilities, I think people often feel they have to alleviate us from our suffering.
If we suffer, and if suffering defines our lives and is all that we experience, or our predominant experience, then why would, it begs the question, why would we want to live?
It to me portrays disability as a life of complete negativity. Nothing enviable about our lives, nothing worthy in our lives. So of course it's going to be equated with death, or that death is preferable to disability.
Suffering has visual and auditory images that immediately come to mind when you use it, and you almost need a cleaner term that doesn't have all these past associations with it.
I don't feel that I'm suffering. I don't feel like I'm vulnerable.
Our lives are rich and they are complex.
The third word we're talking about is compassion. We all would like to have compassion. We would like to be compassionate people, but often people with disabilities, as they are telling us in these interviews, experience compassion as pity, as making decisions instead of, rather than alongside of, people with disabilities. And so in part, when we think critically about the word compassion, we have to recognize that it can be used to justify harm against people with disabilities.
The notion that at its root, compassion means feeling with, fellow feeling. It's a word that links very closely with the word empathy and is quite distinct from that other problematic word of sympathy.
Well, compassion makes me think of pity or sympathy, and that's not something persons with disabilities want. They don't want pity, they don't want sympathy.
Do I think people with disabilities deserve more compassion? No. Again, I think it's that pity thing, and I am not a pity person. I think people without disabilities sometimes believe that people with disabilities are automatically powerless, that they're automatically in pain, and that they're deserving of people's sympathy, i.e., I feel sorry for you.
The phrase compassionate homicide is an excellent example, a really, I'm afraid, a very chilling and disturbing example of how very far off the mark the meaning of this word has strayed, because the word compassion most frequently now, when used in relation to people with disabilities, follows that logic of first exaggerating the suffering of the disabled person, accounting for that suffering in terms of his or her vulnerability, and then responding to that suffering and that vulnerability with a compassion that consists only of, in many cases, arguing for the termination of that person's life as the ultimate expression of this thing called compassion.
Compassion has been used to justify ending people's suffering, relieving suffering. So you can see that sometimes the language is used in ways that builds upon each other. But there is this other side to compassion, this standing alongside of, being in solidarity with, walking in support. And that's the piece that people with disabilities are telling us that they would like to reclaim.
I would not necessarily use the words vulnerable, suffering, and compassion in relation to people with disabilities. Most people with disabilities are generally content with their lives. They are not suffering. People with disabilities are not inherently more vulnerable than anyone else. And people with disabilities don't automatically need compassionate feelings from others.
I think continually using those words in a way which does not preserve the dignity of a person with disability, it just perpetuates the stereotypes.
And these words have become such flashpoints in public, particularly, that I really think we should be addressing the underlying stereotypes and possibly and encourage the use of other words.
The words vulnerable and suffering have a somewhat negative connotation. They do not suggest a sense of power or control.
Yes, I'm not a victim, I'm not suffering, I'm not, vulnerable. I'm just me.
So why should policymakers be interested in reclaiming language? Of what use are critical thinking and talking about these particular words in your day-to-day work related to creating, developing, implementing policies in general? As we know, good policy is policy that reaches the broadest number of people. It's inclusive, and it builds stronger cities, provinces, organizations, country. It helps to build a stronger and healthier society. In this video, we would like to challenge you to reflect on how language shapes policy. The ways in which these three words and others we imagine that you can come up with might affect how we understand what's a good outcome, what's a good result for policy. It might raise the question of who makes decisions when we think about policies in these areas or using these words. Who is included and who is not included? It may be useful for us to, as policymakers, to reflect critically about the language that we use, to stop for a minute and say, okay, when we talk about vulnerable persons in this piece of legislation or in this program, what do we really mean by vulnerability? Does the assumption of that certain people are vulnerable lead us to certain actions? I don't know. But if we don't ask the question, we won't know. So part of the challenge that we would like to leave with you is to begin to reflect, to ask the questions of how language can shape our policies. And if we reclaim language, can we make better policies?